Hi everyone, I'm Lawrence Blah. I'm going to be moderating the first panel. I just wanted to briefly read something here that I think will frame some of the discussion, and then I'm going to introduce the different presenters. The focus of this panel is the role of the hand in design thinking and how we learn during the formative process of architectural education, what Thomas Maldonado called the cognitive perceptive with the figurative operative. Under his leadership at HFFG Ulm, he sought to explore the design process as, quote, a system embodying both scientific-based and intuitive-based thinking. In his essay, The Question of Similarity, he discusses drawing as a type of model making. One does not design or communicate only through elaborate three-dimensional representations, but also through two-dimensional ones that come from spontaneous, intuitive contemplation of a given problem which is to be solved. To draw in order to design also means drawing while designing and designing while drawing. The work or the drawings of Carlos Scarpa can be seen as an instance of this, where design speculation is a nonlinear process across many scales and temporal realities, where process and product converge. Maldonado also clarifies the difference between classical iconic production that represents a proposed building or object and non-iconic models that are diagrammatic. Non-iconic production targets how an object works. Its function and structure are important, not its form. He calls this class of models analogous and includes mathematical models as an example. Gaudi's funicular models come to mind for me, or the formative parametric work of Luigi Moretti applying operational theory to urbanism and stadia. Through the lens of this symposium, questions come to bear on how we learn and think through specific creative processes and how we shape our relationship with the material world. What are the most effective tools, and how do they differ in terms of cognitive response? As the moderator of this session, I simply hope to provoke a stimulating conversation vis-a-vis the potential intersection between neuroscience and architecture. So our first presenter today will be Professor A.Arbib. I'll just give a brief bio that was provided to me. Michael A.Arbib is the Fletcher Jones Professor of Computer Science, as well as Professor of Biological Sciences, Biomedical Engineering, Electrical Engineering, Neuroscience, and Psychology at the University of Southern California. As both a neuroscientist and a computer scientist, A.Arbib argues that by deducing the brain's operating principles from a computational standpoint, we can both learn more about how the brain functions and also gain tools for building learning machines. A.Arbib has written or edited over 40 books and hundreds of scientific research articles. With Giacomo Rosalati, the leader of the research team that discovered mirror neurons, he proposed an evolutionary link between mirror neurons, imitation, and evolutionary language. This work was the basis for his 2012 book, How the Brain Got Language, and his analysis of architect Giovanni Pallasma's Ways of the Hand. As an active board member of the Academy of Neuroscience and Architecture, A.Arbib has developed a range of bridging concepts, including neuromorphic architecture for buildings, which I hope we can discuss today. Professor?
Okay, good morning, everybody. This, as you will recognize, is the Salk Institute, where many of us have found inspiration as a place of great architecture and of research on the brain. And here you will see, again, the URL for ANFA, which I hope will have you as a visitor in the near future. In trying to get into architecture beyond just mere conversation, I was inspired to come upon the Finnish architect Juhani Ballasmaa's book, The Thinking Hand, because indeed one important area of my research has been to understand how the brain mediates between vision and hand actions. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to some of the neuroscience of how the brain and hand interact with various diversions along the way. And then I'm going to come back and offer a few quotes from this book and suggest how the neuroscience may change the way we read those quotes as some indication of this partnership. So first, I just want to say a few words about what neuroscience is and is not, Dan Bucescu talked about the mind and versus the brain. And the point is that we can try to understand the relation between behavior and experience and discuss it in the terms of philosophy or psychology without knowing anything about the brain. And when we try to do science at this level, these days we call it cognitive science. But the brain is a physical structure which we can analyze at many different levels down to the molecular. And so it becomes neuroscience once we start worrying about how those structures and physical processes inside the skull and the rest of the nervous system mediate what's going on. And in particular, when does the study of the brain prove irrelevant to the issues that concern us, and when does it change the way we think about the issues that concern us? And I suspect that will be a continuing theme as we progress through these 2 days. So just to be concrete, or, well, it's not actually concrete, it's biological, but the top left is a diagram based on the work of an early 1900s anatomist who looked at the structure of the cortex and saw that the layered structure varied from region to region and was able to number areas of the brain with a distinctive, what we call cytoarchitectonics, architecture of the cells. And we've done a lot of work in the years since trying to understand the differential contributions of these numbered regions. And we can now go deeper into this from the lesions of the 19th century by the brain imaging of the late 20th, early 21st century. But for some of us, just talking about what different regions do and how they interact is still not far enough into the details. And so the top right slide shows us the cerebral cortex as diagrammed by John Szentagotay, the Hungarian neuroanatomist. And you begin to see there are cells of beautiful structure with complex interactions. We can talk about the architecture of the brain, and that in itself is a fascinating study. The bottom row takes us even further. Here we see some cells and their points of interaction, the synapses. And perhaps one of the biggest fascinations about neuroscience has been to understand in more and more detail the different ways in which synapses can change and how this plasticity, this neural plasticity, can embody learning and memory and allow us to change with experience. The last two pictures go beyond the level that I suspect architects will ever care about. The first shows an electron micrograph of the elaborate chemical structures within a synapse. And beyond that, a colleague of mine disappeared into the molecular biology of the synapse, finding about 30 different components with many different pathways between them. And when I look at that diagram, I say, this is where you make a career decision. Do you really want to understand the brain and its role in behavior, or do you want to do molecular biology? I'm interested in the brain. But one more thing, going up a level, as it were, from the molecules and membranes, the neurons, schemas, I'll just introduce this as a word of art, the idea that if we try to mediate between the language of the mind and the details of the brain, we'll often try to break things down from the psychology. So recognizing an apple for me would be a schema, a perceptual schema. Peeling an apple would be a schema for me, a motor schema. And the issue would be, how are those schemas combined to create a person going up, and how are they to be analyzed in terms of the neural networks to get to the real neuroscience at the heart of it. And but one more thing, as this nice diagram from John Ullman's book, The Evolving Brain, shows, and that is we didn't evolve as creatures to perceive and act alone. We evolved to work in groups. And so the social becomes a very important part of what we have to understand if we seek to understand the brain. The notion of empathy is very much a social concept, and yet if he gets here, Harry Mulgrave will be talking to us about empathy as something that architects might consider in terms of empathy with and for a building. Now, this basically is a variation on the first of those diagrams that Dan showed us, And I put it in a cycle here based on the work of Ulrich Neisser to emphasize that we don't perceive and then think and then act. All three are going on simultaneously, and so that how we act changes what we can perceive in the world. It also changes the world and our relation to it. That creates new possibilities for perception, but that perception may be biased by attention in terms of our current goals, and then that combination of new percepts, prior actions, memories, intentions, issues in more perception, whether perception directed to gain information, specifically for action, or just to continue our exploration of the world. So this, I think when many people talk about mind and brain, it's perhaps a little bit too passive. And for me, the role of action is central to what brains are for. They're to allow us to act in the world. Now, the discussion of the hand in my own career started with this figure, the incredible jumping hand. And in fact, this work from Lyon in France was making the point that when you reach to grasp an object, you not only have the brain controlling the arm to get the hand where it needs to be, but the hand is already being pre-shaped to the properties of the object. And a great deal of work went on in trying to understand the patterns of computation in the brain that could mediate this behavior. But what I'd like to focus on here is an amazing piece of what I call dissected phenomenology. For many people thinking about architecture, phenomenology, the way we experience ourselves in the world, is very important. But a point that I think Eduardo Bancani will develop is that as children, as lovers, as aging persons, we all experience the world in different ways. And with brain lesions, we can learn that what appear to be seamless phenomena of consciousness, in fact, require subtle integration. So what this picture shows is that as we, let me master this skill, we can leave the visual cortex and get to the front of the brain, either going through this dorsal path up to parietal cortex or this ventral path down to infratemporal cortex. And my colleagues found two patients with lesions in one or the other. So the woman who had a lesion down here had the following interesting thing. You'd show her cylinders of different diameters, and you'd say to her, tell me how wide the cylinder is. She couldn't tell you. Her verbal utterance had no correlation with the diameter. You'd say to her, well, pantomime for me. No correlation. You'd say, okay, just go ahead and pick it up. And as she went to pick it up, the peak separation of thumb and forefinger was perfectly correlated with the diameter. So here was a pathway that could carry out the parameterization for how to carry out the act, but she had no declarative access to that information. Whereas the other patient, studied by my French colleagues who had the lesion up here, could tell you how wide the cylinders were, but when asked to reach for it, she couldn't carry out a transformation from the visual perception to the action. So she had to reach out with hand fully outstretched, and then only the sense of touch, the hapsis, allowed her to grab this. So this dissociation into different components begins to provide the transition, as it were, from the mind to neuroscience, as we begin to understand how subsystems interact. Then those insights were complemented some years later by work of my colleagues in Japan and Italy, who began to turn to the monkey, the macaque monkey, whose brain for reaching to grasp is sufficiently similar to ours, that there we can get, rather than lesions or crude brain imaging, we can get fine detailed study about individual neurons. They did the following. So in this part of the parietal cortex, AIP, anterior intraparietal sulcus, it doesn't matter what the name is. The important point is that when Sakata and his colleagues in Tokyo put their needles in there to record from individual cells when a monkey was reaching to grasp an object, it was the visual emphasis relevant to the grasp that was important. So in other words, a small cylinder, a small cube, a small sphere if they were all going to be grasped with a precision pinch, the cells in AIP would fire the same way. Whereas if we went down that other Watt pathway down into the infratemporal cortex, we would find differential firing to say, oh, it's a cube, oh, it's a sphere. And then Rizzolatti and his colleagues in Parma in this area, they labeled F5, but the important point is it's premotor cortex. It's just in front of the motor cortex. There, it seemed that the cells were firing for particular types of grass. So one cell would fire vigorously if the monkey was going to make a precision pinch. Another would fire vigorously for a power grasp, and so on. And then, some years after discovering this, Rizzolatti, top left in the rogues gallery there, and his colleagues in Parma made a fascinating discovery. Over here we can see the sort of data that I've already alluded to. The monkey is reaching out to carry out a precision pinch to retrieve a piece of food. Here is the firing of a particular neuron in F5 on each time. So the histogram shows that this is something the neuron really cares about. And if we recorded the same neuron during a power grasp, there would be no activity. But here was the interesting thing. Leo Fugassi one day was placing, this is his hand, placing, well, actually it's a picture of his hand, homage to Magritte, was placing using a precision pinch to place the food for the monkey to grasp, and lo and behold, the cells started firing, not quite as vigorously, but as we can see from the histogram, still very vigorously. So this was the discovery of mirror neurons, neurons in the brain that are active not only when the monkey executes a suite of actions, but when the monkey observes a similar range of actions. There are more subtleties to the story, but that's enough for what we want to discuss today. This diagram returns us to the level of the human, because once people had found that there were these mirror neurons in the monkey brain, they said, are there mirror neurons in the human brain? Now, in general, you can't talk about neurons, but what you can say is there an area that lights up during imaging in a way that suggests it's an area full of mirror neurons? And so they found a little area up here that seemed to respond to orofacial movements, and whether the human was observing, as you can see in the little videotape extracts, a dog biting, a man biting, or a monkey biting, this area lit up. And then they did the same experiment where the human subject was observing a human talking, no sound, just a video, a monkey with oral communication, just teeth chattering and lip smacking, or a dog barking. And now if we go back to this area, we see that the area that is active for the human communication is barely active for the monkey, not at all. So let's not read the text. The important point is that it seems that we can recognize, obviously, that the dog is barking, so we don't need the mirror neurons for actual recognition. That's perhaps more that how pathway, that what pathway we talked about, but it provides a motoric enrichment. And so when we see an action that is part of our own repertoire, our experience with that action enriches the perception in a way that, unless we like to bark at dogs a lot, we won't have with the barking dog. Okay, so next, when we did the imaging in the human brain to say where do we have these mirror neurons, or at least where do we have a part of the brain that lights up both for hand actions and for observation of hand actions in the human, it turned out to be in Broca's area. Broca's area was traditionally thought of as a speech production area. So what is the recognition of hand movements doing with the production of speech? Well, fortunately, I knew this lady, Ursula Bellugi, at the Salk Institute, again, and she and her husband had been the pioneers in recognizing that sign language was not just gesturing, it was a full language with a grammar. And then she asked, well, if people have brain damage that causes aphasia in speakers, would that same brain damage cause the analog of aphasia in signers? And so from her we learnt that Broca's area is not a speech area, it's a language area. And if you're a signer, if you use sign language, then the same sort of process is going there. So at the periphery, yes, vision in versus sound in, hand out versus voice out. But in the middle, associating patterns with meanings, aggregating them into sentences, production, perception, those mechanisms are shared. So that led Giacomo Rizzolatti and myself to suggest that we had found a neural key to those people who suggest that the path to language was not directly through the voice, but built on manual gesture. And so we published a paper in '98 with the cute title, Language Within Our Grasp, and this grew over the next 14 years of my work into the book that I'm advertising now. Unfortunately, I must complain to Ralph, I did not see copies for sale at the desk out there, but just joking. All right, so the idea is that the crucial point about language is that, as I hope I'm demonstrating now, when I intend to convey a message, you get that message, so that we have actions that produce actions that are perceived. And so we're suggesting that the mirror neurons that grounded this in the practical domain of hand actions for the monkeys in our common ancestor provided the evolutionary basis for the use of hand actions for communication, and that in turn grounded their use in speech. So the intermediary, I think, is what I'll call complex action recognition. This is the idea that when you recognize a behavior, you're not just, as in those basic monkey experiments, recognizing a single action. You're rather recognizing that the behavior is built of several familiar actions, and you can see how they're put together to achieve some goal, and that provides your overall perception of what's going on. And then imitation is the ability to understand from that analysis how actions are put together to achieve sub-goals towards an overall goal. And so the suggestion is that we have that in a way that chimpanzees do not. And I don't have time to explain the distinction, but the crucial idea I'll suggest is that this ability for complex action recognition, complex imitation, evolved in the hominid line since our last ancestor with the chimpanzee, and it's this that evolved in the first place to help us share skills, to begin to build a culture, as it were, but not yet a linguistic culture. So, to reduce several chapters of the book to one slide, the notion is that that our common ancestor with the monkey shares with us a mirror system for grasping. Our common ancestor with the chimpanzee has a simple imitation for grasping and a certain amount of a very simple system of manual gesture, one at a time. We evolved complex imitation, spreading our skills. And then the suggestion is once you could recognize a sequence of actions in relation to a goal, you could begin to recognize those actions in the absence of objects as an attempt to communicate something about that goal or about the nature of the object being acted upon. In other words, pantomime, not the conscious pantomime of a Marcel Marceau, but the naive pantomime we use in the restaurant in a country whose language we don't speak. But the trouble with pantomime is that it can take a long time to produce the pantomime, and it's highly ambiguous. So the next transition in this evolutionary story was that people learned how to come up with abridged pantomimes with better defined meanings, proto-signs, which required that you were a member of the community to have been able to assimilate those specific signs, but now you could communicate both more quickly and with less ambiguity. And then I suggest that we had an expanding spiral from there, where once we had that ability to put together novel gestures to express novel meanings in open-ended ways, that provided the evolutionary impetus for us to regain control of the vocal musculature and vocal learning in a way that no other primate has. Now, somebody who's written a lot both on primate cognition and on child development is Michael Tomasello, and what he suggests that differentiates us in a complementary way from the apes is what he'll call ratcheting. So in other words, if you look at apes, they will have some simple cultures. Ability to use a simple tool might catch on in the group, but that's it. Whereas humans come up with an innovation, and then other people treat that innovation as a unit and build new skills on top of that. And so we now live in a culture where we have millennia of ratcheting up. So we depend on electricity and smartphones and glasses and all those many other things. Okay, so that creates the space for what we can call cultural evolution, where we're not changing the biology of the brain and body specifically, but we are now creating innovations upon innovations upon innovations. And so the suggestion is that the ability to communicate in single proto-signs or proto-sounds was where we got to with the biology. Ratcheting was where we got to with the biology. Complex imitation was where we got to with the biology. But building on that to go from a simple communication system to language and all the cultural products that language makes possible, that was primarily post-biological, a matter of cultural evolution. Okay, so now I'm ready to give you the promised quotes from Juhani Ballasmaa and to offer my little comments upon them. So he says, the hand is crucial to the evolution and manifestations of human intelligence. And what I've tried to do with the mirror system hypothesis that I've just laid out is give hands a key role in charting the evolution of human intelligence and language. But I think from the way Juhani writes, he's perhaps putting more of the intelligence in the hand without acknowledging the complex brain structures that had to evolve to make that use of the hand possible. He wants to say human consciousness is an embodied consciousness. The world is structured around a sensory and corporeal center. And again, I think we have to distinguish the external world from our own construction of it, and that when we look at our mental structures mediated by the brain, they're based in the first place on that action-perception cycle, but in the end, as we develop through language and other symbolic constructs, we transcend, I believe, that. So that embodiment for me is a basis, but not the end-all of our knowledge. And then he wants to say the knowledge and skills of traditional societies reside directly in the senses and muscles, in the knowing and intelligent hands, and are directly embedded and encoded in the settings and situations of life. But again, it takes a brain to link senses and hands to support that intelligence, and it requires the brain's plasticity to acquire the social schemas of a particular society. So I have another slide of quotes, but I think I'll skip it now. The important point is that when I read Ballasmaa, I get a fine sense of the architect's intuitions, the phenomenology of architecture, the importance of the body in, for example, appreciating a door handle in a way that the design marries beauty and utility. But I believe we add a lot when we think about the brain. And the particular example I want to run you back to is of those two ladies, one who could tell you about the cylinders but didn't know how to appreciate for grasping them, and the other lady who could grasp adequately but couldn't tell you about it. As we begin to see that our seamless phenomenology, that is an important part of our intuition, nonetheless can be enriched by an understanding of its constituent parts, because then as we enter the design process, we may see that we have to carry out different strategies for our design to accommodate those different portions. So, to put I'm almost done, but what I want to emphasize at this point is that we have the brain and the body evolving together, but what's also evolving is the cognitive and social niche in which our brain and body shape society and become shaped by society. And then we are to think, I suggest, of architecture as a social product that needs both that reference, as it were, to the biology on the one hand, go back to the hand, and to the cognitive social niche on the other. So in the last few slides, I want to, as it were, open up the discussion that will be emerging through the morning of hand versus, and it's the versus that causes me to put a question mark at the end of hand versus symbol. So Moshe Safdie, the Israeli architect who became famous for his work on habitat at the World Expo in Montreal, was interviewed recently in the New York Times, and he said, architects get seduced by wild shapes designed on a computer and build these things whether they work or not in the environment. That's the danger of computers. There's a facility about them that allows you to do charming, seductive things that have no deeper meaning. And then apparently he says he wanders around his office handing out pencils to see if people recognize what they are. But I really wonder whether handing out pencils is the key to architectural education in the 21st century. And surely drawings are potentially even more charming and seductive, whether or not they carry deeper meanings. Let me just quote Johanni again, who also is very keen on the importance of this. The computer creates a distance between the maker and the object, whereas drawing by hand or building a model puts the designer in skin contact with the object or space. Now I want to emphasize, somehow my attempt to emphasize it on my slide got lost, but building a model. When people talk about drawing as so important, I wonder whether what's really important is the art of construction, the art of building models, the ability to take a huge reality, whether it's a mountain top or a building, and reduce it to a scale at which one can work with the hands. And then the drawing would be a secondary skill to that. So I think that may be worth further discussion. And it's nice that he says, in imagination, the object is simultaneously held in the palm of the hand and in the brain. We are inside and outside the object at the same time. Ultimately, the object becomes an extension and part of the body. And that's a whole other talk about the nature of tools and the way in which tools do become an extension of the body. And what does it mean if we think of a building as becoming an extension of the body? But back to this Safdie objecting about unduly speculative use of the computer. Here is a sketch by Frank Gehry. I think it was for the Guggenheim Bilbao. Well, it is a little speculative, isn't it? And in fact, for those of you who have not been to Bilbao, he did not build this. The final result was somewhat different. I think another thing, I think in discussing again the neural correlates involved, it may be better to understand a sketch like this, not so much in terms of holding in the hand the three-dimensional structure, but an aide-memoire of a fleeting exercise of the imagination. So it's not so much that you hand to your team a picture like this and say, build it, but rather it lets you capture a range of intuitions that can then enter into discussion. And so here's sort of what happens after a few iterations as Gehry talks to his crew, and you begin to transit from the sketched shapes, the more evolved shapes in his imagination. That imagination becomes constrained both through the actual building of three-dimensional models and through the development of sketches that begin to become detailed. And what I'm interested here is not only the difference between the first sketch and the second sketch, but also the way in which we already begin to see details. And one of the themes I think is interesting about developing a notion of the language of architecture in relation to language is that in language we pretty much stick with a stock of words and put them together. But as we see here in architecture, we may come up with new components to put together so that the lexicon, as it were, as well as the grammar can both change. But I also want to cite this new book called Co-Designers, because I think it's very relevant to a discussion of Gehry, even though to my surprise Gehry doesn't appear in the index. And here we consider architecture as a social process organized increasingly around simulation. The idea is that it's nice to look at pictures together, but if you have a computer simulation, The people discussing the simulation may not have the skills to program or understand the structure of the program, but with this they can try out ideas dynamically and share the results of those ideas dynamically and make suggestions in a way that can cooperatively converge on a design, but in a simulation framework that can also hold more and more details as we move towards construction. And of course, in this, we are very much harking back to the use of aerospace design methodology as incorporated by Geary Studio, where we see here the 7 steps from digitizing the physical model, what followed from a great deal of discussion on the sketches, the surface model, the shaded surface model, the primary structure, secondary structure, beginning to put pieces on the edges, curvature analysis. I think this should lead quite well into the next talk, maybe, and shop drawing, and then finally we have all the details needed to produce the actual building. So the neuroscience of drawing versus CAD leads one to ask the question that although for people like Safdie and Ballasmar, the sketch is so crucial a part of the process, might not a new generation raised on computers be able to imagine just as vividly on the computer? And I think perhaps doing some brain imaging on older and younger architects in relation to these different methods of creativity might well be an example of a specific neuroscience study that would be of value to our conversation of neuroscience for architecture. But I want to return to that comment I made when quoting Ballasmar and my thinking that maybe it's the making of 3D models where the shaping of space is transferred to what the hands can handle, and thus entering into that system that I've suggested underwrites our capacity for symbolism. This may be a more important but more constrained issue than drawing per se. Timescales. This is a little bit of a detour now, but since we're beginning to think about computers in the context of design, I just want to bring in this notion of, we think about a building as stable for decades. The interior, we think of walls being realigned more often. The interior design can change. Furniture, the time scale shifts even more rapidly. And I suspect that we're going to increasingly see virtual reality as part of interior design, and you may want to debate whether that's part of architecture as well, where we can have ever-shifting aspects of a building. So what I think we may see increasingly is augmented reality, the blending of real and virtual worlds. So we already know that spaces have a profound emotional impact on people. We already know that architecture in some sense augments reality. A new building is a new reality that shapes the experience of its owners and inhabitants. And so as we think of the smartphone revolution and other changes in computer graphics, immersive experience, so we may begin to create realms defined by artifacts that become more digital than material. And with an interesting change of scale, since I set up the slide, I come to the end of my talk, where this conversation between the intimate involvement of the hand as a physical object with physical objects in the design process, and the emergence of language, and then the development of our human languages into their digital form on computers, the passage from the original number crunching to the way in which we can now create virtual realities means that, in some sense, that transition to language and the symbol has come full circle to create new and augmented realities in which perhaps architecture will go forward. Thank you very much.